Mia gritted her teeth as she stepped out of the cafe, her hands tightening around the paper bag holding a stale croissant she barely had the energy to eat. Rain drizzled from the gray sky, soaking into her already terrible day. First, she had been chewed out by her boss for something that wasn't even her fault. Then her car refused to start, and now because life clearly had a personal vendetta against her, her umbrella snapped in half the second she opened it. She let out a frustrated groan and tossed the useless umbrella into the nearest trash can. Of course, why not? The streets of Manhattan were crowded, people rushing by without a second glance at her miserable state. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as the cold seeped through her thin coat. She just wanted to go home, crawl under a blanket, and pretend this day never happened. But life wasn't that kind. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move forward, when suddenly she lost her footing on the slick pavement. Her ankle twisted, and she braced for impact only to collide into something solid, warm, and very much alive. Strong hands caught her before she could hit the ground. Whoa, careful there. Mia blinked up at the man who had saved her from complete humiliation. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was slightly tousled from the rain. His piercing blue eyes studied her with concern. She swallowed, her cheeks burning. "I'm so sorry." "No harm done." His voice was deep, smooth like velvet against her frazzled nerves. She pulled back, embarrassed, brushing her damp hair out of her face. "It's just been a long day." He nodded as if he understood completely. Bad days have a way of piling up, don't they? She let out a dry laugh. "You have no idea." His gaze flickered over her soaked coat and the broken umbrella still sticking out of the trash can. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his own coat and draped it over her shoulders. Mia stiffened. "Oh, you don't have to." "Take it," he said firmly. "You're freezing." She hesitated but eventually pulled the coat around herself. It was warm, expensive, and smelled faintly of something rich and masculine. "Thank you," she murmured, glancing up at him. "I'm Mia, by the way." "William," he said with a small smile. "Nice to meet you, Mia." She should have handed him his coat back and walked away, but something about him made her pause. Maybe it was the kindness in his eyes or the effortless way he had helped her without hesitation. "Would you?" She hesitated, feeling ridiculous for even asking. "Would you want to grab a coffee with me, just to end the day on a better note?" For a second she thought he might decline, but then that small smile widened. "I'd love to." And just like that, the worst day of her life didn't seem so bad anymore. The moment they stepped inside the cafe, warmth wrapped around Mia like a comforting embrace. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and pastries filled the air, pushing away the lingering chill from the rain outside. William held the door open for her, his presence effortlessly commanding yet not overbearing. She picked a small table near the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass, casting a warm glow over the room. William set his coat over the back of a chair and gestured for her to sit. "I'll get the drinks," he said. "What would you like?" "Just a regular coffee, black," she answered, hesitating before adding, "Thank you." He nodded before making his way to the counter. Mia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The day had been an exhausting mess, yet here she was, sharing a coffee with a man who had appeared out of nowhere, rescuing her from what could have been the worst moment of her night. She took the opportunity to observe him as he waited in line. His posture was relaxed yet poised, as if he was completely at ease with himself. There was something about him, an air of quiet confidence, of someone used to being in control. It was captivating in a way she couldn't quite put into words. He returned a few moments later, setting their drinks down before taking the seat across from her. "Black coffee, just as requested," he said, pushing her cup toward her. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "You didn't have to do this, you know," she said, watching him take a sip of his own drink, "but I appreciate it." "I wanted to," he replied simply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of conversations around them filled the silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt oddly natural. "So," he finally said, leaning slightly forward, "what made today so terrible?" Mia let out a dry laugh. "Where do I even start? My boss decided I was an easy target for his bad mood, my car decided it no longer wants to be a car, and the universe thought it would be hilarious if my umbrella gave up on life the second I needed it. William's lips twitched, his expression amused but not mocking. That does sound like an impressive streak of bad luck. She sighed, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I don't even know why I'm telling you all this. It's not like you need to hear about my problems. Maybe not, he said, but sometimes talking to someone who isn't involved makes it easier. She studied him, noting the way he spoke with a certainty that suggested experience. You sound like you know that from personal experience. His gaze flickered downward for just a second before he met her eyes again. I do. There was something in his tone, something unspoken that she could have pressed on but she didn't. Instead, she decided to shift the focus. What about you, she asked. What do you do? The question made him pause as if he was carefully choosing his words. I run a company, he finally said. She raised an eyebrow. That's vague. He chuckled. It's a bit complicated. Mia shook her head, taking a sip of her coffee. Mysterious and helpful, quite the combination. William's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something almost hesitant, as if he was holding back. Before she could dwell on it, he spoke again. What about you? What do you do when you're not battling the universe? She let out a short laugh. I work in marketing, not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills. Do you enjoy it? Mia hesitated. It wasn't that she hated her job, but it wasn't exactly fulfilling either. Some days are better than others. He nodded as if he understood completely. That's how it is with most things. The conversation flowed from there, shifting from work to more casual topics. She learned that he enjoyed classic literature, that he had a weakness for dark chocolate, and that he had traveled to more places than she could count. And yet, for all that he shared, there was still a veil of mystery around him. He answered questions without ever revealing too much, and she found herself wanting to know more. Minutes turned into an hour, and before she knew it, the cafe was starting to thin out. I should probably get going, she said reluctantly, glancing at the time. William reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black card and setting it on the table. Let me call you a car. She blinked. That's not necessary. I can take the subway. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. It's late. Something about the way he said it made her reconsider. He wasn't just offering out of politeness, he genuinely didn't want her wandering the city alone at night. After a moment, she relented. All right. He made a quick call, speaking in a low tone before slipping his phone back into his pocket. The driver will be here in 5 minutes. Mia studied him, curiosity gnawing at the edges of her mind. You don't really strike me as the kind of guy who randomly helps strangers. He held her gaze. Maybe you're not just any stranger. Her breath hitched slightly, caught off guard by the weight of his words. Before she could respond, a sleek black car pulled up outside. William stood, offering his hand to help her up. As she stepped outside, the driver opened the door for her. She turned back to him, suddenly unsure of how to end the night. Thank you, she said softly, for the coat, the coffee, the ride, everything. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but instead, he simply nodded. She hesitated for a split second before stepping into the car. As the door closed behind her, she glanced out the window, watching as William stood under the streetlights, hands in his pockets, watching her leave. Something about the moment felt significant, though she couldn't quite explain why. As the city lights blurred past, one thought lingered in her mind. Who exactly was William? Mia stepped inside her apartment, kicking off her damp shoes with a sigh. The ride home had passed in a blur, her mind busy replaying every detail of the evening. William, the warmth of his coat, the quiet intensity in his gaze, the way he had insisted on making sure she got home safely. She shook her head, setting her bag on the counter. It had been a chance encounter, nothing more, a fleeting moment that didn't need to mean anything. And yet, as she curled up on her couch, staring at the rain streaking against her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just walked away from something significant. The following morning, Mia dragged herself to work, determined to push the previous night out of her mind. The office was its usual chaos, filled with the hum of ringing phones and hurried footsteps. She slipped behind her desk, flipping open her laptop just as her manager, Greg, strode in. Mia, he barked, dropping a thick folder onto her desk. We've got a presentation with a high-profile client tomorrow. I need you to put together the marketing strategy before the end of the day. She blinked. End of the day. Did I stutter? He didn't wait for an answer before disappearing into his office. Mia exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to slam her head against her desk. It was going to be a long day. Hours passed in a blur of research and frantic typing. By the time evening rolled around, her brain felt fried. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her aching shoulders when a familiar voice sounded behind her. You look like you could use a break. Her pulse stuttered. She turned, her breath catching as she found herself staring at the last person she expected to see, William. He stood there, effortlessly composed in a tailored navy suit, his presence commanding even in the midst of the hectic office. The sight of him here in her workplace sent a jolt of confusion through her. What are you? She trailed off, her gaze flickering to the group of executives gathered near the conference room. And that's when it hit her. The way people subtly glanced in his direction, the respectful nods, the quiet murmurs. William wasn't just visiting, he belonged here. Her stomach twisted. You work here. His expression remained unreadable, in a way. Before she could demand an explanation, Greg appeared at her side, his demeanor shifting instantly. Mr. Blackwood, he greeted, his voice taking on an uncharacteristic politeness. Mia stiffened. Blackwood. Her mind scrambled to connect the dots. Blackwood Enterprises, the powerhouse corporation that had recently acquired her marketing firm, the same company she had been preparing a presentation for all day. Her heart slammed against her ribs. William Blackwood was the CEO. The realization knocked the breath from her lungs. The man who had lent her his coat, who had shared coffee with her like any ordinary stranger, was one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. And he hadn't said a word. Greg continued speaking, oblivious to the turmoil in Mia's head. Mr. Blackwood, we're honored to have you visiting the office today. We've been working hard on the campaign strategy for your approval. William's gaze remained locked on Mia, I have no doubts. Greg turned to her, his tone suddenly dripping with forced courtesy. Mia, why don't you bring your strategy to the conference room? Mr. Blackwood will be reviewing it personally. She barely managed a nod before Greg strode away, leaving her standing there still reeling. William took a step closer, lowering his voice. Mia. She held up a hand, her pulse pounding. Not here. His jaw tightened, but he gave a small nod. Grabbing her laptop, she marched toward the conference room, doing her best to ignore the way her hands trembled. The meeting passed in a haze. She presented her strategy with as much professionalism as she could muster, answering questions while avoiding William's gaze. He remained calm, composed, offering occasional input, but she felt the weight of his attention with every word she spoke. By the time the meeting concluded, her emotions were stretched thin. As the other executives filed out, William remained seated, his gaze steady on her. She exhaled sharply. You lied to me. His expression didn't waver. I never lied. You didn't exactly tell the truth either, she shot back. You let me believe you were some ordinary guy. I never claimed to be. His voice was measured, but there was something else beneath it, something almost uncertain. I wanted you to know me without all of this. He gestured vaguely at the polished conference room, the towering glass walls that overlooked the city, without the expectations. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to find out like this, in front of my boss? His expression darkened. Greg doesn't respect you. She frowned. What? He speaks to you like you're disposable, he said, his voice laced with quiet intensity. I saw it the moment I walked in. She crossed her arms, ignoring the way her pulse jumped at his concern. That's not the point. Then what is? She hesitated, struggling to put her emotions into words. It's the fact that I told you about my life, the mess, the struggles, and you sat there, knowing you could never relate. You let me think we were on equal footing when we never were. His jaw tightened. I didn't want my name to change things. But it does, she shook her head, stepping back. I need to process this. Something flickered in his eyes, but he gave a small nod. Take all the time you need. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding. She had spent the night thinking about William, wondering what it would have been like to see him again. Now she wasn't sure she wanted to. Mia spent the following days trying to untangle the confusion in her heart. Logic told her that William's wealth and power didn't change the fact that he had been kind to her when she needed it most. But emotions weren't so easily reasoned with. She had opened up to him, believing they were on equal footing. Now she wasn't sure what was real and what had been a carefully controlled illusion. And yet, despite her frustration, she couldn't ignore the way her mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he had looked at her in the cafe, the way his voice had seemed to soften just for her. She thought she had made her decision to put space between them. But when her phone rang and she saw an unknown number, something deep inside her knew it was him before she even answered. Mia, his voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet urgency she wasn't prepared for. She hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. How did you get my number? I have my ways. There was a pause. I need to see you. She wanted to say no, to tell him she needed more time. But the truth was, she had spent the past few nights trying to ignore the ache of missing him. Where? She asked, already knowing she would go. Look outside. A strange shiver ran through her as she crossed the room and pulled back the curtain. Parked at the curb was a sleek black car, its tinted windows concealing whoever sat inside. She turned back to the phone. You're unbelievable. I know. There was a slight exhale, almost like a chuckle, but it lacked amusement. Will you come? Mia hesitated for only a second before grabbing her coat. The moment she stepped outside, the driver opened the door for her, and she slid into the luxurious interior. William sat across from her, his posture composed, but there was something in his gaze, something almost vulnerable. She folded her arms. This is a bit dramatic, don't you think? I didn't think you'd agree if I asked you the normal way. She hated that he was right. So what is this? He studied her for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. I didn't tell you who I was because I didn't want it to change things between us, but I see now that it has, and I need to fix that. She sighed, leaning back against the plush leather. It's not just about the money, William. It's about the fact that you let me think we were the same when we're not. His jaw tightened. You think I don't understand struggle? She frowned, caught off guard by the intensity in his voice. I didn't grow up with money, Mia, he said quietly. I built everything from nothing. I know what it's like to have doors slammed in your face, to work twice as hard just to be taken seriously. Her breath caught. I didn't know that. Because I didn't want you to see me as anything other than the man who met you on a rainy night. Something in her chest softened. The car slowed to a stop, and she glanced out the window, realizing they had pulled up to the waterfront. The city lights shimmered over the water, casting a golden glow over the sleek yacht docked nearby. She turned back to him, eyes narrowing. Tell me we're not getting on that. His lips curved slightly. We are. Mia let out a breath, torn between exasperation and intrigue. You don't do anything halfway, do you? Not when it comes to you. The words sent a shiver through her, but she didn't let herself dwell on them. Instead, she followed him onto the yacht, stepping onto the deck where a small table was set with flickering candles and a bottle of wine. The city stretched behind them, a breathtaking view that felt almost unreal. William pulled out a chair for her, waiting until she sat before taking his own seat. You didn't have to do all this, she said, gesturing to the setup. I wanted to. He poured her a glass of wine, then met her gaze, his expression unreadable. I know I complicated things, but I need you to understand something, Mia. I don't want to be just a passing stranger in your life. Her heartbeat stuttered. William. I know it's fast, he continued, his voice quieter now. but I felt it the moment I met you, and I think you did too. The honesty in his words, the raw sincerity, made it impossible to deny. She had felt it too. She exhaled, gripping the stem of her glass. I don't know how to fit into your world. Then I'll meet you in yours. Her throat tightened. That's not how it works. His gaze held hers, unwavering. It is if we want it to. The simplicity of his statement made something inside her crack wide open. He wasn't asking her to change, to become someone else. He was saying he would meet her where she was, no matter what it took. She looked down at the flickering candle between them, the warmth of its glow casting shadows over the table. You scare me, she admitted softly. William leaned forward slightly. Why? Because I think you might be the first person who actually sees me. For the first time that night, a flicker of something almost gentle crossed his face. And that scares you. She nodded. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing over hers. Then let me prove to you that you don't have to be afraid. Mia swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. This was crazy, reckless even. But as she looked at him, this man who had pulled her out of the rain, who had seen her at her lowest and still wanted her, she knew one thing for certain. She wanted to take the risk. So she didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers with his. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe in something bigger than fear. Mia stared at their intertwined fingers, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. She had expected hesitation, fear even, but instead, there was only a quiet certainty settling deep in her bones. William had cut through all her defenses with a simple truth: he saw her, and despite everything, he wanted her. The yacht swayed gently against the water, the sounds of the city a distant hum behind them. The candlelight flickered between them, casting golden shadows across William's face. His eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering, as if waiting for her to process what she'd just agreed to. She took a slow breath. I don't know how to do this. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, reassuring. Neither do I. She let out a quiet laugh. That's hard to believe. You seem like the kind of man who always has a plan. A trace of amusement flickered across his face. In business, yes, but this, he shook his head, there's no strategy for this. Mia looked down at their hands, the heat of his palm grounding her. So what now? William exhaled, his thumb brushing lightly against her knuckles. Now we take it one step at a time. It was such a simple answer, free of complications, and yet it was exactly what she needed to hear. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the night stretching around them. Then William stood, tugging her gently to her feet. I want to show you something. Curious, she followed him across the deck. He led her down a short passageway until they reached a private lounge area. The space was sleek yet inviting, with panoramic windows offering an unobstructed view of the city skyline. A bottle of champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket beside a set of plush armchairs. Mia raised an eyebrow. Do you always have a yacht ready for impromptu late-night conversations? He chuckled, not exactly, but I wanted tonight to be different. She studied him for a moment, taking in the way his usually composed expression softened in the low light. You really don't do things halfway, do you? When something matters, no. His voice was quiet, but the weight in his words sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to the window, watching the way the city lights reflected against the water. After a beat, she asked, why me? William moved closer, standing just behind her. What do you mean? She hesitated before turning to face him. You could have anyone, someone who fits into your world without question, without hesitation, but you chose me. Why? His blue eyes darkened, his gaze searching hers. Because you're real, because when I met you, you didn't care about any of this. He gestured vaguely at their luxurious surroundings. You weren't trying to impress me, you were just you. Mia swallowed, her heart pounding, and that's enough. He stepped closer, his voice low, more than enough. For the first time since meeting him, she allowed herself to believe it. Outside, the wind carried the distant sounds of the city, but here, in this quiet space, it was just the two of them. No expectations, no barriers, just a man and a woman standing at the edge of something terrifyingly beautiful. Mia exhaled, letting go of the last piece of doubt clinging to her. "All right," she murmured, "one step at a time." William's lips parted slightly, and then, after a brief hesitation, he leaned in. The kiss was slow, deliberate, as if he was giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she didn't. She melted into him, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, deepening the moment. The world outside blurred, and for the first time in a long time, Mia didn't feel lost. She felt found. When they finally pulled apart, William rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I meant what I said that night," he murmured. "You're not just any stranger." Mia smiled, threading her fingers through his. "Neither are you." And as the city lights shimmered around them, she realized maybe she didn't have to figure everything out right away. Maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth risking it all for. Mia hadn't expected life to change overnight, but from the moment she agreed to take things one step at a time with William, her world shifted in ways she never could have imagined. Their nights together became a quiet escape from the chaos of the city. William was still a man of power, still the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, but when he was with her, he was something else entirely. Softer, more present. He listened when she spoke, never distracted, never disinterested. He made her feel like the most important person in the room, even when that room was filled with people far more glamorous, far more powerful than she was. But as much as she was drawn to him, there was still a part of her that hesitated. She had spent her whole life working to prove herself, to earn her place. And now, she was falling for a man who could give her the world with a single phone call. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of his penthouse, overlooking the glittering skyline, Mia voiced the thought that had been lingering in her mind. "You live in a world I don't belong in," she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "I don't know if I'll ever fit." William, seated beside her, turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "And what makes you think you need to?" She hesitated. "Because people will expect it. Your world is different. It has rules, expectations." "Rules I don't care about," he interrupted smoothly. "Do you think I want someone who fits into a mold? I don't. I want you exactly as you are." His words sent a warmth through her, but doubt still clung to the edges of her thoughts. "It isn't that simple." William reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "It is." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He had built his empire from nothing, had climbed his way to the top with sheer determination. And yet here he was, willing to fight for something as uncertain as love. The thought terrified her and thrilled her. A few weeks later, Mia found herself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting the deep emerald dress William had sent her. The fabric hugged her in all the right places, elegant yet understated. She wasn't used to designer gowns or exclusive events, but tonight she was stepping into his world willingly this time. The gala was held at a grand estate just outside the city, the kind of event filled with people who spoke in measured tones and sipped champagne like it was water. William had his hand on the small of her back as they entered, his touch grounding her. "Just stay close to me," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. She nodded, but it wasn't long before they were approached by a group of executives, eager to speak with William. Mia stood quietly by his side, listening as they discussed business dealings that felt like a foreign language to her. Then one of them turned to her. "And what is it that you do, Mia?" The question was polite, but there was an underlying curiosity, a thinly veiled judgment. Mia straightened her spine. "I work in marketing." The woman nodded, a practiced smile on her lips. "Oh, how interesting. And how did you and William meet?" Mia's fingers curled slightly against her dress. She opened her mouth to respond, but William spoke first. "She was the best thing to happen to me on a rainy night," he said simply, his voice carrying enough weight that the conversation around them quieted. "And every day since." Mia turned to him, her breath catching. There was nothing performative in his words, no grand speech for the sake of appearances. He meant every syllable. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback, before offering a pleasant smile and excusing herself. Mia looked up at William, her heart pounding. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said, his gaze steady. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone, least of all them." Something in her chest loosened, the last shred of doubt unraveling. She loved him. The realization was sudden yet inevitable, as if it had been waiting for her to acknowledge it all along. That night, as they drove back to the city, she turned to him and said the words that had been burning on her tongue. I love you. William didn't hesitate. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips before meeting her gaze. I've been waiting for you to say that. Her breath hitched. You have. He nodded, because I've loved you since the moment you crashed into me on the street. A laugh bubbled out of her. That's a little dramatic. He smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. Maybe, but it's true. Months passed and their lives intertwined seamlessly. Mia no longer felt like she was standing on the outskirts of his world. She was part of it not because she had changed, but because William had made space for her. Then one evening, he surprised her with a private dinner on the rooftop of his building. Twinkling lights surrounded them, the table set for two beneath the stars. As they finished their meal, William reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Mia's breath caught. He opened it, revealing a ring simple, elegant, timeless. I could give you the world, he said, his voice steady, but none of it means anything without you. Marry me, Mia. Tears pricked at her eyes. William. No more doubts, he murmured. No more hesitations, just us. A slow smile spread across her lips. Yes. The moment the word left her mouth, he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a depth that left her breathless. Their wedding was a private affair, held in a secluded garden surrounded by only their closest friends. As Mia walked down the aisle, her heart felt light, free of the uncertainty that had once plagued her. She knew now this was where she was meant to be. When she reached William, he took her hands in his eyes filled with nothing but love. You changed my life, he whispered. She smiled, squeezing his hands, and you changed mine. As they exchanged vows, as they sealed their love with a kiss, Mia knew this wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, it was them. And it was forever.